I'm Jake, a 22-year-old male currently attending Clemson University in Clemson, South Carolina. Seeing as it is my last year at the uni before I graduate, my friends and I planned a camping trip for the last week of school. The hardest part was fitting everybody into my Jeep, but we managed it. "What the heck is that, Chase?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "A blunt, duh." Chase was the stoner of our group, because every group just has to have one. He was a little chubby white boy about 5'8", with brown hair pulled up in a bun and just enough chin hair to look like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. "Come on, man, you're not gonna hotbox my car," I exclaimed. I would shake my head in disbelief if I wasn't so used to it. "I agree with Jakey. At least save it for when we get there," Blair chimed in. Blair was the most playful one of our group, at least around me. She was about 5'6" with fair skin, long red hair and light freckles around the bridge of her nose, and she had bright green eyes. "Thanks, Blair," I said with a sigh of relief. She smiled at me and went back to playing whatever choose-your-own-adventure game she had recently installed. We didn't even make it 5 minutes without another argument in my back seat. I let out another sigh. It's going to be a long week, isn't it? When we arrived at the forest, I made sure to do a head count in case we had lost anybody at a rest stop. Okay, there's Blair and Chase, staying as far away from each other as possible. There's Aljo. Aljo was a really muscular guy with dark skin who stood around 6'2". Had a dark high-top hairstyle and a well-maintained beard. And then there's Corey, by far the nicest person in our group. Corey stood at about 5'3" and had caramel-colored skin, and curly brown hair that framed her face nicely. "So Jake, what are we waiting for?" she asked in the nicest way possible. "Let's go enjoy the great outdoors." I half expected her to end up singing to the little woodland creatures on our way there. No point in delaying it any longer, I guess. While we were scouting out the forest for a good campsite, I felt strangely calm. There's just something about being in the woods that feels so serene. The birds singing their sweet songs as the sunlight reflects through the beads of dew on the leaves is just so relaxing. My moment of peace was interrupted, however. Something was off. It was just enough for you to notice, but not enough to pinpoint. I stopped walking and I concentrated on finding the source of my unease. After a few moments, my eyes caught it. One bird was out of sync. All of the other birds were singing in perfect unison, but this little guy was a half beat behind. Nobody else seemed to notice it, so I just kept walking. I still thought it was a bit weird, but oh well. The little guy was probably still learning after all. When we finally found a site that we could all agree on, it was almost dark. Chase and Corey started building a campfire, while Blair, Aljo, and I began assembling the tent. "So Jake," Aljo began, "you brought the arrows, right?" "Of course. Did you bring the bow?" I responded. Instead of responding, he simply tossed the bow my way. I grabbed it and I tested the drawstring. It felt nice and strong, tight but reflexive. It was a beautiful maplewood bow gifted to Aljo by the Navajo tribe that we had met a few years back in Utah. I set it down near his tent and I got to work helping Blair set up ours. "Here, let me get that for you," I said as I hammered a tent spike down. "Oh, thanks, Jakey," she said with a smile. "I'll go get our bags." Before she could take a step towards the car, Chase showed up in front of her. "I'll go with you then," he said with the creepiest wink that I've ever seen. He has a really punchable face, I thought. "How about you just go get them by yourself?" Blair retorted with a wink of her own. Chase sat in defeat and started off towards the car. While Chase was getting our bags from the car, the rest of us sat around the campfire. Corey was talking to Aljo with a bright smile on her face, as usual. I heard something about it being a nice night for s'mores before I was reminded of the redhead sitting next to me. "So, Jakey, you ready to spend a whole week with us?" Blair asked playfully. She said us, but I knew she was more so asking if I was ready to spend a week with her. "There's no one I would rather be stuck with," I replied with a wink. Her eyes lit up at this and her smile grew wider, making me wonder what I had just gotten myself into. She grabbed my wrist and yanked me towards the tent. Blair, you sure this is the best time for this?" I asked hesitantly. "Oh, shut up, Jakey." She pulled me in the tent and zipped away my view of Aljo, giving me a thumbs up and Corey just staring, innocently wondering what was happening. I turned around to find Blair, tablet in hand. She held it out to me and she told me to choose a game. Well, this isn't what I thought was going to be happening. I tapped on one called, not much time, and I sat down on the tent floor. She sat next to me with her head on my shoulder and we alternated choices in the game. Apparently this one was about somebody who suddenly had the power to stop time. My first choice was whether to use my power to help somebody, steal from someone or hurt someone, or just restart time. I decided to help someone. "Oh, come on, that's so boring, Jakey," Blair whined. She, of course, used her choice to hurt somebody the next time that we played. We ended up replaying the game about 5 more times before we eventually fell asleep. When I woke up, I could see rays of sunlight peeking in through the small holes in the tent. My right arm was still asleep, so I went to move it, but I couldn't. I looked over to find Blair hugging my arm like a teddy bear. I let out a sigh and I gently freed my arm from her death grip. I noticed the dead tablet on the floor and I plugged it into a portable charger. I unzipped the tent and I walked out into the fresh pine-scented air. I thought that I was the first one awake, but that thought was shattered when I noticed smoke coming from Chase's tent. Really? This early in the morning? I relit our campfire and I boiled water for some oatmeal. I made sure that I had enough for everyone and I poured in the packets. In a few minutes, I had 2 bowls of oatmeal and I headed back to Blair's tent. "Hey Blair, I made breakfast." She was still asleep. "Hey dummy, I got you something," I said as I nudged her with my foot. She whined about not wanting to go to school today and tried to go back to sleep. I sighed and I put the bowl down in front of her face and, like a dog, she sniffed a little bit and then opened up her eyes. "Oh, hey Jakey," she said as I rolled my eyes. I sat down next to her and I ate my oatmeal. Well, I guess it could be worse. Throughout the day, we each did various chores around camp. Blair and Corey decorated everybody's tents. Chase got wood for the fire and Aljo and I went hunting. Aljo was more familiar with the bow than I was, so I ended up wielding my knife. My knife was a 6-inch Bowie, so it made it easy for kills close up, while Aljo was our ranged predator. So far, all we had seen were rabbit and deer tracks, but neither of the animals that had left them. We set up some snares for the rabbits and decided it would be best to set up an outpost in a tree to let the deer come to us. We found a decent-sized tree and we climbed up to wait in the branches. While we waited on our prey, Aljo was dead silent. I felt calm and focused, like I was a born predator on the hunt. But this feeling was quickly shattered, leaving only unease in its wake. My eyes scoured the forest floor for something, anything out of place. And that's when I saw it. There was a single deer grazing on the dew-covered blades of grass. As it gated to another patch of grass, I studied it for abnormalities. The problem was easy to identify, as the deer walked differently from any deer that I had ever seen. Its steps were janky, uncertain almost, as if it thought the floor might give out from beneath it. It would tap the ground with its front hoof in one spot, and then stomp the same hoof down a foot away from where it tapped. As it did this, it was making a noise. It sounded almost like a low growl. Now maybe there was an explanation for its lurching steps, but I know deer don't growl. As I thought this, the deer's head suddenly jerked up towards me and Aljo. My breath caught in my throat and my heart lurched as violently as the deer had stepped. The deer, no, the demon was now gazing into my very soul with its bright yellow eyes. I couldn't bring myself to look away. That is until Aljo fired an arrow into the damn thing. The thing let out the most blood-curdling screech I'd ever heard before, or ever since. It took off into the bushes and we got the hell out of that tree. That night, we were all chilling by the campfire eating s'mores. Corey and Aljo were talking again and really seemed to be hitting it off. I smiled at the thought of my two friends being happy together, and they certainly deserved it. Chase had gone into the woods to take a leak and should have been back any time now. I started thinking about that deer again. What was that thing? It couldn't have been a deer. I'll try to keep you all sit. I was broken on my thoughts by a small hand gripping mine. I looked to my right to find Blair smiling at me. "What you thinking about, Jakey?" she asked in her usual playful tone. "Just how good these s'mores are," I said with excitement. "Thanks for bringing the chocolate." She laughed and punched my arm. "You're a bad liar, you know that, Jakey," she teased me. "No, really, these are great, babe," I replied in between bites. She laughed again and rested her head on my shoulder. We were all laughing about some embarrassing memories of Chase when we heard an ear-piercing screech. My heart threatened to jump out of my chest and into the fire. It was the same screech that the deer had made earlier that day. Aljo and I shared a glance and we jumped into action. I grabbed my blade and he grabbed his bow and quiver of arrows. We were about to head out to find Chase when Blair grabbed my hand and looked me straight into the eyes. She didn't need to say anything for me to know that she was scared. I looked over at Aljo and I only received a nod in response. He headed out while I sat back down with Blair and Corey. He was capable of handling this on his own, and I couldn't just leave Blair and Corey defenseless. I gripped my knife tighter and tighter as the minutes turned to hours waiting for Chase or Aljo to return. Blair tried to calm me down and assured me that everything would be okay, but I knew neither of us really believed that. As the sun's light began to cut through the trees, Chase walked back into camp. I jumped up and I rushed towards him. He looked toward me and my steps faltered. For a split second, I thought I saw yellow eyes staring at me from his baggies sunken in orbitals. I blinked and they were back to his normal stormy gray. I'm going crazy, aren't I? I thought to myself. Where have you been? I asked in a more panicked tone than I had meant to use. Taking a leak, he said. I thought there was something wrong with his voice, but it was back to normal so quick that I just brushed it off as me going crazy once again. Blair came over to my side and asked Chase some questions, but he seemed to be normal Chase. Corey, however, stayed by the now dying campfire. Where's Aljo? She asked, fear weighing heavily in her voice. I don't know, Chase responded, with that weird tone again. I made a mental note to remember that tone shift. Corey took a stumbling step backwards. I don't believe you, she screamed at him. This wasn't like her at all. What happened to that sweet little woman who was always smiling? I thought. Chase took a lurching step towards her and I instinctively moved in between the two, gripping my knife with white knuckles. I had seen this type of movement before. He looked me up and down and he walked to his tent. Something's very wrong here. Blair and I spent the rest of the day trying to comfort Corey in any every way that we could think of. We made her some more s'mores, and gave her a shoulder massage, and played games with her on Blair's tablet, but none of it worked. She just kept insisting that I go look for Aljo. I wanted to, I really did, but I couldn't just leave them with Chase. There was just something off about him, and I couldn't trust him. It was almost sundown, and Blair was cooking a rabbit over the fire. The sky was a deep pink, and the clouds looked blue against it, making it look like a giant sheet of cotton candy. When Blair was done making dinner, I walked to the door of Chase's tent, and I reluctantly called out, "Dinner's ready." No response. I tried again, but still no response. My patient was wearing thin, so I unzipped the door of his tent. I looked inside, surprised at what I found, rather surprised at the lack thereof. Chase was gone, and there was a huge hole in the back of the tent. I had suddenly lost my appetite. The girls ate dinner, and then we all decided to catch up on some sleep and wait for Aljo and Chase to come back. Blair and I went to our tent, and Corey went to hers. We zipped the door shut and crawled into our sleeping bags. Blair snuggled up to me as I drifted off to sleep. I was awoken by the sound of a screech that sent a shiver down my spine and chilled my blood. I bolted upright and I unzipped the tent door, rushing out into the cold night air. The moon was like a resplendent glacier, gleaming as rays of sunlight danced through its icy core. I could see clearly in the night, even without the fire. I rushed over to Corey's tent to see if she was alright. What I found made me almost collapse. Her tent was empty, and in the back was a gaping hole exposing the forest on the other side. I found my knife and I sheathed it at the hip. I made to leave when Blair stepped in front of me. "You aren't going alone. I'm coming with you," she said. And who am I to stop her? I told her to stay close to me, and we started off into the forest. My heart was racing inside of my chest to get out and escape this damn forest. I dashed through the brush on the forest floor, running for my goddamn life. I had lost Blair a few minutes ago, but as much as I willed myself to go back for her, my body wouldn't stop running. I was in fight or flight mode, and I had subconsciously chosen flight. I kept running until I came face to face with Aljo. I felt relieved at first until I realized that he wasn't blinking. In fact, he had no eyes. God. His cheeks were torn into a permanent smile, his eyeballs gouged out, and his ears ripped off, leaving only bloody holes on the side of his head. I looked down at his body. His right pec had been cut off, exposing his ribcage underneath and his gut agape, with his innards spilling out like a never-ending rope that a clown would use. I turned to run to my left, but I was met with the body of Chase, in a similar state to that of Aljo. I stumbled backwards and I turned to run the other way, but I was met with Corey. What was done to her, I won't describe. I already have to see it every night in my dreams. I crumbled to my knees and I threw up what little I had in my stomach. And that was when I heard a familiar voice. "Oh, Jakey, you almost got away." I tried to crawl away, but I was kicked hard in the ribs. I rolled onto my back, gasping for air and begging for mercy. Blair slammed a knee down on my chest and thrust an arrow through my cheek. I howled in pain as the blood flooded down my throat. My lungs burned for oxygen as I began to drown in my own blood. Blair realized this and gripped the arrow in my cheek, using it to turn me onto my side. She couldn't let me die now. She wanted to make me suffer. She tore the arrow from my face, leaving a bloody hole in my face. She rolled me onto my back again, and plunged the arrow into my chest and ripped it down to my gut. She proceeded to carve out my gut until she could freely peel off my skin and fat, leaving only the muscle exposed. She then stuck the arrow into my eye and began clawing at the exposed muscle of my abs. Every second was enough pain to make me wish that I was dead. But I just needed to grab my knife. She grabbed the arrow and carved Nalehe, the Navajo word for property, into my right pec. I felt the cold, bone-mold handle of my blade and gripped it tight. I brought it up into her eye and I dragged it down the side of her face. She recoiled off of me and let out that all-too-familiar screech and took off into the night. I was found by other campers later on, unconscious from loss of blood. They had me helicoptered to the nearest hospital. The doctors began surgery right away and miraculously saved my life. You can't trust anyone. I learned that the hard way. Once you trust someone, you become their property. I know because the scars will never fade, the memories will never fade, and my pain will never fade. And I will always be that thing's property.